So, hello everyone. It is now 10 o'clock and we should get started. Well, welcome. We're delighted that you could join us for this webinar. My name is Beatrice Dupuy and I am one of the co-directors of Circle. And joining me today is Kate Mackay, Circle's Associate Director. Before we start today's webinar, I have a few announcements that I would like to make. So first, I would like to share with you some information about Circle. Circle is housed in the College of Humanities here at the University of Arizona and is one of 16 language resource centers funded by the U.S. Department of Education under Title VI. On this slide, you have the link to Circle's website and the link to the Language Resource Center's general website where you can find out about the work all the LRCs do and the free resources that they offer. This spring, we planned 3 webinars. Today is our second webinar, with the third one coming up on May 11th. And this webinar will focus on gender-just pedagogies. We also have planned an in-person summer institute, which will be led by Kathy Short and Dorea Klecker on June 2nd and 3rd. This institute is based on a Circle project and will focus on incorporating global text in the classroom. So the presenter of our webinar today is Dr. Tracy Quan, who is an assistant professor of Spanish at the University of Colorado Boulder, where she teaches undergraduate and graduate courses on language, linguistics, and pedagogy. Her areas of research include second and heritage language development and education, language and identity, study abroad, and critical pedagogies. Drawing on her personal background and K-12 experiences teaching Spanish and English here in the United States, but also abroad, she's interested in exploring the dynamic role identities and ideologies play in shaping language learning, teaching, and use, particularly for racialized multilingual populations. She hopes her research will demonstrate the transformative and equitable potential of language education and research if done critically and thoughtfully. She is co-editor of the volume Heritage Speakers of Spanish and Study Abroad, which was published in 2021 by Routledge. So without further ado, I now leave the floor to Tracy, whose webinar is entitled Strategies for Challenging Ideologies in Language Instruction. Tracy?
All right, well, so I just want to, again, thank you to Circle for this invitation. It's an honor to be here. And thank you to all of you for tuning in today to just have this conversation with me about language ideologies in our teaching. Okay, so just to, again, give you a very brief background about my teaching experience and where my interest in ideologies and language instruction comes from. Again, I have very briefly taught high school Spanish in California. I've been an English teacher abroad in bilingual schools in Spain. And I have also taught a lot at the university level, both in Spanish language, linguistics, and pedagogy courses. And a lot of my interest in ideologies has to do with my personal background. So I'm a heritage speaker of Cantonese. And so I've had a lot of firsthand personal experience with ideologies and how that has impacted my perspective, personal perspective on my abilities and my identity as a Cantonese speaker. And also at the same time, I'm a language learner of Spanish who identifies as Chinese American. And so having been a Spanish teacher and also an English teacher, I have also felt ideologies that suggest that I don't really belong in this profession as a Spanish teacher, given my racial phenotype, and also have been questioned as an English teacher because of my phenotype. And we'll talk a little bit about that today. But so I want to start off by thinking about why is challenging ideologies important? And so I think that our role as language instructors is really critical, given how, on the one hand, we all use language to mediate our experiences with the world. And language is also really deeply intertwined with our identities, right? And again, that's very, speaking very personal for me, but also on the existing research that is out there that shows that interrelated connection. And then on the other hand, we are also always consciously and subconsciously using language to police, to judge, and to gatekeep across educational contexts and across society at large, right? And so the words of Gloria Ansaldúa, Chicana author, really, I think, resonates this idea of why it's so important. And so she says, if you want to really hurt me, talk badly about my language. Ethnic identity is twin skin to linguistic identity. I am my language. Until I can take pride in my language, I cannot take pride in myself, right? And so I think that the message, really speaks to this idea of, once again, thinking about how we teach language and how we talk about language can have a huge effect on communities of speakers and on our students. So for today, this is just a very brief outline of what we're going to be doing. So we're going to start off by talking about language ideologies, and raciolinguistic ideologies, and the definitions that I'm drawing on to define what I mean by that. We'll also talk about examples in language instruction. I'm going to focus primarily on 4 language ideologies, but there are many, many more. But the idea is to get us to really start noticing and thinking about our language instruction from an ideological perspective. The third, we will be looking at the consequences of ideologies for both students and teachers alike. And then the fourth are critical pedagogical approaches, frameworks that we can draw from, and things that we can maybe keep in mind as we think about our instructional practices and how we plan activities in our lessons. And a lot of the examples that I'm using today come from Spanish. That's the language that I research and I teach, but I will interject with opportunities throughout today's webinar for you to think a little bit more about the languages that you teach and also your teaching context, right? Okay. And so I'm hoping that by the end of today's webinar, you'll be able to do the following. So you'll be able to think broadly in describing ideologies related to language instruction, identify pedagogical strategies for unpacking ideologies, and then also critically reflect on opportunities for and challenges to teaching language in a culturally, linguistically, and socially equitable manner. Okay, so what are language ideologies? I'm going to start off with a little brief activity where I want you to think about what are some characteristics that are often associated with someone who uses the following, right? And so in that bubble there, if you think about, what are the social characteristics associated with a person who uses this feature here? And I'm welcome to, I invite you to, enter your thoughts in the chat or simply jot it down for yourself, right? But I'm just going to give us maybe about 30 seconds for you to think about what words or what impressions might be associated with this feature. So I see in the chat, I see lower class, uneducated. English teachers often point out double negatives, which isn't always grammatically wrong. Not educated. I see the word family, rural Texas, not standard English, assumption that the person is less smart or not educated. My father-in-law, rural areas. I'll give it about maybe 10 more seconds if anybody else wants to add anything. Low socioeconomic status, L2 or L3, power and hegemony. Great. Yeah, so some of you obviously have thought about language ideologies to associate with words like power and hegemony, someone being playful with the language. Great. So as one of the audience members brought up, right, there is this prescriptive rule in English where you don't, right, you don't use double negatives, ain't and no, and if you do, you might be viewed a certain way, right? And many of the ways that were brought up, such as lower socioeconomic class, or not well educated, right, or associating with more regional or rural dialects, all of that basically to go to show this idea of what language ideologies are, right? And so I draw from this definition of Woolard's, which is this taken for granted assumptions about language that become the suppressive premises of judgments of an individual's social worth. And so as many of you brought up, right, these characteristics that we associate with a particular language feature, and then in more popular culture or in society in general, we take it as taken for granted assumptions that someone who speaks like this are associated with these characteristics. And just to give you another example, I love looking at word reference forums because you can see a lot of the comments there are oftentimes great pieces of evidence of language ideologies. And in this case, you can see here a member who talks and brings up a lot of the characteristics that many of you also brought up, right? And so when they hear speakers use ain't, got, no, this idea that it's painful, that it's very slangy, that they don't like the sound of it, and then also that it's associated with really poor people in the United States. All of these characteristics associated, again, with this idea of one's social worth simply because they're using this language feature, right? So alongside language ideologies, we also have raciolinguistic ideologies. And so raciolinguistic ideologies are beliefs about language use, structure, and users that are grounded in the historical and contemporary co-naturalization of language and race. And so in this case, we're associating ways of speaking or a language with a particular racialized person and attributing characteristics to them. And so one example, some of you might have heard about this case, right? But in 2018, there were two Spanish speakers in Havre, Montana, somewhat close to the border of Canada. And they were, because they were speaking Spanish in this small, town, so to speak, in Montana, they were associated with being undocumented. And also because given their racialized bodies as Latinx appearing individuals, they were thought of as undocumented peoples in the United States, right? And they were detained. And so this is an example of a raciolinguistic ideology in which speaking Spanish is all of a sudden associated with a certain legal status in the United States, right? And associated also as well with this Latinx body, right? And so I want to now, taking those definitions of language ideologies and raciolinguistic ideologies, think about what are some examples within the language instructional context, right? And there are so many, like I mentioned earlier, ideologies, but I'm going to focus on 4. And again, the idea is to sort of think about or reframe our perspectives on how we think about language teaching, and about our and our students' relationships with language, right? And I've chosen these examples in particular because they're generalizable across language contexts and very much prevalent across our field of language instruction. Okay, so I'll focus on the first one, right? And so the first one is this idea of one language, one person, one race, or one nation. And it kind of ties to that previous example that in the case of in the US, right, we very much still have this ideology that in order to be, American, one speaks English, right? And that is why when one hears Spanish in certain parts of the United States, it turns into, there's these associations that those individuals are not American, and it's associated with, legal status in this country, et cetera, right? And so I provide an example here from Spanish, right, where we see it also in Spanish language instruction. And so in this case, we see how Spanish is typically associated with the Latinx or Latinidad identity, which is also associated with a particular phenotype. And in this case, looking ethno-racially mestizo, so of mixed European and indigenous and sometimes African ancestry, and having national ties to a Spanish-speaking country in Latin America or Spain. And so we have these one-to-one relationships of expectations of what a Spanish-speaking person typically looks like and is typically associated with in terms of nationality. And you see these sort of one-to-one mappings happening, like simply just in the case of like Duolingo and other tech companies, you find this association of a national flag with a language, right? Even though we know that, for example, Spanish is not just tied to Spain. We know that French is not just tied to France, right? But we see these reproductions of this one-to-one mapping. Another example in the case of Spanish is this idea of how racial and ethnic representations of speakers of a language are represented in teaching materials, right? And so there's this study that came out from Padilla and Mana, a very recent study, right, where they were looking at the representation of Afro Latinx in across 12 beginner level Spanish textbooks, right? And we want to first keep in mind that about a third of Latin Americans have ancestry, right, African ancestry, and that's about 130 million, right, Latin Americans, right? But according to the study, what they did was they looked at all of these textbooks to look at, the representation of Spanish speakers in these beginning level Spanish textbooks. And what they found was that only 9.8% of the images clearly referenced this population of speakers, right, of African ancestry. And oftentimes when they did represent them, it was in the second half of the books, and it was always in a very reductionist manner, right? And I give another example here on the right-hand side, that in this study, they saw that the representations of these speakers were often associated with slavery or musical contributions, right? But nothing else more nuanced nor more substantial. And so, it raises the question of how are we representing Spanish speakers to our students? And what is that saying? But in the sense that we are only representing a certain type of person phenotypically to our students. And I give another example. This one is coming from a Chinese textbook, integrated Chinese, and I brought this example up. I don't teach Mandarin Chinese, but I brought this example up because I took Mandarin classes as a graduate student, and I remember seeing this textbook and the characters in this textbook and how they were represented, and thinking that one is that all of the characters match this one-to-one mapping, right? So if you look at the characters, for example, Wang Peng is on the top left-hand part of the image, and the description of this character is, he is a native speaker of Chinese, he's from Beijing, and that's, that one-to-one mapping, right? And then you look at the other students, for example, Amy Lee or Leo, right? She's an American student, but in this picture, it was a little bit racially ambiguous, but as you look at the images of the rest of the textbook, she's perceived as a white American student, reproducing again this idea that we are all one-to-one mappings, and she's a learner of Chinese. And I was just thinking, as I was in this classroom, as I looked around, where most of myself and my classmates, we didn't quite, none of us, not none of us, but the majority of us didn't fit, right, these images, and it didn't quite, for me, feel like, okay, I don't fit these categorizations of who, a Chinese language learner from the US with a different background looks like, right? And so this ideology of the one language, one person, one race, one nation, sends certain messages to students, right? It's, one, that maybe real speakers of a language adhere to a stereotypical ethno-racial phenotype. And so students might have these expectations. Second, that everyone who looks like or shares a similar racial, ethnic, or national identity must or should speak the same language. So according to this ideology, there's an assumption that all Mexicans speak Spanish, right? But that's not the case. There's many Mexicans who may only speak an indigenous language. And so this ideology pigeonholes these identities. And then third, that anyone who deviates from this one-to-one relationship must be a foreign other, or not really from a particular national, ethnic, or racial group. And again, I had brought up earlier this idea of what does it mean to be American in the US, or how English intersects with whiteness is perpetuated, right, through this ideology. The second ideology that I want to talk about is the monolingual and native speaker ideology, and it very much connects to the previous one that I brought up. But based on this ideology, to be considered a legitimate speaker of a language or a native speaker, one should demonstrate monolingual language abilities, as well as align with a particular phenotype and nationality. And so oftentimes when we think of somebody who speaks a language like Spanish, we also think about, okay, is this person a native speaker of Spanish? And to be a native speaker of this language, they have to demonstrate monolingual language abilities, right? And I think that at our field of language instruction and language pedagogy, we have definitely become more and more aware of how the native speaker is problematic, right? But I think that we still have a way to go. A lot of our goals for language instruction for students and even researchers, right? The end goal is still native speaker-like abilities, right? And so based on this ideology, teachers, we have all been trained, right, to emphasize target language only immersion. And, this is coming from ACTFL, where one of our core practices is 90% or more target language use. And I'm not saying that shouldn't be, that's not a worthwhile goal, right? I think we all can agree, for those of us who are language instructors, that in our classrooms, we want to maximize target language use. However, I think what happens is that we often frame non-target language use as something that's very negative, or as a deficit or a hindrance to language learning. And I think that that's the notion that I want to challenge, and I think others in the field are also starting to question, is that if we are truly trying to engage our students with becoming multilinguals, then we really have to question this target language only immersion and use, right? As the only way for us to get to that multilingual goal for our students. And so we have to also think about, if students decide to use other languages, right, other home languages or English, it could be used for strategic communicative reasons, or it can be a scaffolding tool, right? Both from peer-to-peer and both peer-to-instructor interactions that can ultimately also lead to more target language learning, right? It's not necessarily that any non-target language use is bad, right? And I think that in itself is another ideology. And so I think that the monolingual native speaker ideology is very problematic, because it suggests, it sends messages to students about, one, that target language speakers use language monolingually and monoglossically. And so that's just not the case, right? Second, that languages are meant to be compartmentalized, and that students as other languages may interfere with rather than benefit the learning of the target language. So again, this idea that we want our students to come into the classroom and all of a sudden turn off all of their other languages that they know and that they have access to, I think is creating a very false reality and environment, right? And I think that we can reframe our thinking to instead consider, right, how can we leverage what students already know and are able to do in their other languages in our language classroom. And then third, I think that individuals who don't demonstrate monolingual language abilities, or who don't match the expected phenotype of a language, are not fully considered bilingual or really native speakers, right? So if you think about, especially heritage speakers, right, it's the monolingual and native speaker ideology that really sets them as not having the sufficient language capacity to be considered native speakers, right? And it's very problematic. And then the monolingual ideology is also what leads to the stigmatization of bilingual, multilingual practices, right? So individuals who engage in code switching or translanguaging are all of a sudden seen as not being fully native speakers, or not fully having language ability, right? And again, it's because we're framing it from this monolingual expectation. Okay, the third ideology that I want to bring up today is this standard language ideology, or this idea that there's a standardized variety, right? And that the standardized variety, this hypothetical standardized variety is associated oftentimes with educated communities, with middle upper class communities, and also groups with power, basically, right? And somebody in the chat earlier brought up, power and hegemony, and this is where it definitely connects, right? But this ideology refers to the idea that there is a normative privileged variety, which is associated with educated middle upper class individuals, and again, groups with power. And so in the case of Spanish, right, the standardized variety first of all, the standardized variety differs depending on the context, right? And so in the case of Spanish, we can have Castilian Spanish from North Central Spain as one standardized variety, or Mexico City Spanish could be another standardized variety. But they're all examples of standardized varieties that are privileged in US academic classroom settings compared to non-standardized or non-privileged varieties, like rural varieties, varieties that have been influenced by language contact, or those associated with racialized populations, right? And this standardized language ideology leads to a lot of prescriptivism in how we teach and how we make decisions about what we teach in our classroom. And so in other words, instead of describing how someone uses language, language instruction tends to focus on what we should or shouldn't use according to what is allowed within the standardized variety, right? And so going back to the earlier example with I ain't got no, that's an example of which in an English language classroom, we probably, most teachers probably don't teach that because that's not the standardized or prescriptive norm in an academic classroom setting, or the type of English that's expected in an academic classroom setting. And so to give you some examples of how we see this in our language instruction, right? Here's an example in the case of Spanish. And this is looking at personal second person pronouns. And one of the ways that standard language ideology really plays out in our language instruction is how it reduces sociolinguistic variation in our language teaching, right? And so here's an example from a textbook. This is a beginner level textbook. And I use this example to just show how there's a complete exclusion of another second person pronoun in Spanish that is actually is much more used than the one that's presented in the textbook. So just to explain here what's going on, right? So in the first part, pronouns for you, we have the typical informal and formal distinction in Spanish of tú and usted. And then in the third part, plural you, right? We have, again, informal and formal plural you. And then interestingly, right, almost in all Spanish textbooks, there's always the teaching of vosotros and vosotras. And that's a plural you that's used only in Spain, right? But there's a complete disregard for vos, which is another second person singular pronoun. And if you look on the map on the right-hand side, vos is actually one of the more popular pronouns compared to vosotros. I mean, I think that sociolinguists have found cases of vos usage across almost every single Spanish-speaking country except for, I believe, Spain, Puerto Rico, and the Dominican Republic, right? So there's a much more extensive use of vos compared to vosotros, right? And so then the question comes up as to why that's the case, right? Why do we continue to teach? We choose to teach one form over another, and what message does that send to our students, right? What exactly? How do we make these decisions? Another way that we see standardized language ideology in action is how textbooks also talk about language, right? And so here's an example from another textbook. This is more of a second year or intermediate level Spanish textbook. And I've translated this little snapshot on the right-hand side. And so here it says in Spain, so once, it highlights one particular country, and it is very common to use the pronoun le instead of lo or la for the direct object. This phenomenon is known as leísmo. The substitution of the masculine pronoun le for lo is correct and admissible, but the use of le instead of la is considered incorrect. And then below you see the standard form and then the leísta form, right? And so I've highlighted some of the language being used here. You can see this idea of some things are correct and admissible, other things are incorrect, and then there's the standard form, right? And so these sort of examples, one, bring up this idea of, well, language use from certain privileged contexts, like Spain, is more important, because in these two textbook examples, and I would argue that in many of our the Spanish language textbooks, Spain is still very much one of the prioritized language varieties that we teach, right? In those textbooks. And so it, again, here it's highlighting once again that, it's important that we know how language is used and accepted in this particular region. And it doesn't at all in this snapshot reference the fact that this phenomenon called leísmo is used in other varieties of Spanish, right? Like Paraguay or Andean Spanish, it's not mentioned whatsoever. Second, the way that the language is used to describe this linguistic phenomenon brings up this idea that, okay, yeah, we should think about language prescriptively rather than descriptively, right? That language can be dichotomized in this way as correct, incorrect, right, and wrong, right? And this is important that we recognize this, because from a linguistic perspective, right, all varieties and language features are the same. There is no correct, incorrect, right, or wrong in the sense that's being presented here in the textbook, right? And so it's potentially sending a message to students that that we should think about language in this way, right? And then it also sends the message to students that certain varieties and their speakers are more or less prestigious because of their presence or absence in teaching materials and in the curriculum in general. And so by excluding, let's say in the previous example, the uses of voz, we might be suggesting to our students, like speakers who use voz, it's not a variety that you should pick up on, because that's why we don't teach it to you, right? These are sort of underlying messages that can be sent to our students. And so these three ideologies that I've talked about so far, right, they're very much connected, right? And so in this case, when we talk about this idealized native speaker, right, that they have monolingual language abilities, and it's connected in that the ideal monolingual language abilities that is expected is this standardized variety, right? And so you can see them all connected here. And it's these ideologies are connected and also are what produces these hierarchies between having the standardized variety and speakers of the standardized variety at the top, and everybody else that doesn't quite fit this, right, in the hierarchy. And so the last ideology that I want to bring up is that all of these, what I just showed in the previous slide, really contribute to also a prototypical L2 learner. And it's this imaginary L2 learner that I think many of us have been trained to teach, right, or to build our curriculum for this audience. And so if we follow the logic of the one language, one person, one race, one nation ideology, if we're teaching in a North American context, then we assume that American, quote unquote, American students would also be Anglo, white, English monolingual speakers with no personal connection to the target language, because we're following this one-to-one mapping, right? And also, I think that language instruction also tends to presume students are, from a heterosexual background, and that they come from a middle upper class background. And so our curriculum and the way that we present certain material is geared towards that hypothetical idea. And so you can see, like an example, this is another one from a Spanish textbook of just talking about sentimental relationships. And you can, it's very heteronormative, right? When we're talking about sentimental relationships, we see it between, what is perceived as a man and a woman, a very traditional courtship, right? It's also targeting this idea of a upper middle class lifestyle, right? Of purchasing a ring, they're getting married, they go on honeymoon, they buy a house, right? All of this sort of expectation of what we think our students are expecting, right? And so I think that the conception of the prototypical L2 learner, this ideology, it suggests that students who don't fit this expected model may not be successful or have their needs met, right? So learners that don't fit this prototypical idealized L2 learner, and that language instruction is designed for them, and it's primarily geared for them. And so what we see oftentimes in our departments is like, if we have students who don't fit this prototype, then we have to create alternative tracks or alternative courses for them, right? So, we have heritage language learner tracks. We have, students with disabilities, we might have to create a separate track for them because they don't fit our idealized, right, model, or they might be excluded, right? I've been in departments where certain classes are just, they say like, if you are a bilingual speaker, then you're just not, you're not able to be included in these courses, right, for XYZ reason. Yeah, and I appreciate also, yeah, that in the chat, somebody just brought up this idea of able-bodied, and I did not include that, right, in my prototypical to learner, but definitely, right, we have these expectations of the learner being able to move around and interact in certain ways in our classrooms, and those are part of the methodologies that we've been socialized to teach, right, in our teaching methods courses. And then second, I think that this prototypical L2 learner also leads teachers to position students as such, even if that may not be true. And so, a lot of times I've had students in my, I'll call them, the traditional L2 learner language classes, and they'll tell me, yeah, I haven't been exposed to other languages growing up, right? But then later, as I talk to them more, I find out, right, that in fact, it's that they've had, Yiddish speaking grandparents at home, and they never thought of that as having exposure to another language at home. They had sort of seen themselves as, well, I'm an L2 learner of Spanish, so I'm an English dominant speaker, and that's my background, right? And so again, I think the way that we position our students can affect how our students see themselves, and it might, for us to inadvertently position them in that way, regardless of whether or not that's true. So I want to take a pause here, and I want to give you some time to think about two questions, right? The first one is, how are these ideologies present in your language teaching context? So I know that a lot of us come from different target language teaching contexts, or just like K through 12 versus university, et cetera. Some of us are not in the North American context. So I want to give you about a minute to reflect on that. And also, what are some of the consequences of these ideologies for students and teachers? What do you think, are some of the effects, right? And so I'm just going to give maybe a minute, and you're welcome to put your thoughts in the chat, or maybe just jot them down for yourself, right? And if you have any specific questions at this point, I think it should go in the Q&A. So I'll just sort of pause here for about a minute. So I'll just read some of the comments that are coming up in the chat. So I see Catherine Burns brought up ideology of Spanish is spoken that primarily happens outside the United States. Definitely, and I think that also goes back with this idea that that Spanish is associated most likely with certain nationalities, and not including necessarily the United States, even though the United States, we have the second, I believe the second largest Spanish-speaking population. And the fact that we don't necessarily incorporate oftentimes local varieties and local Spanish-speaking communities into our instructional, in our curricular design and our instructional practices. I also am reading in the chat from Jessica Cox, right? Yeah, exactly that. So if we have this prototypical L2 learner in mind, and that's what our curriculum is designed for, we oftentimes, I hear, teachers feeling frustrated, like, what do I do with these students who don't fit that? Whether it's because of their language abilities, or whether because they're international students, and so their background is not necessarily L1 English. And oftentimes in the North American context, we teach thinking that the L1 is always English, right, for our students. I also see like Jimena's comment about how there are easier languages to teach and more difficult languages to teach. Yes, that's also an ideology that affects how students approach, right, language instruction, and how teachers think about the teaching of those languages. Okay, so I see a lot more chat action going on that I unfortunately can't slowly read each one, but I will move on then. I'll read Liz's question. So Liz had a question: how do you provide students with tools to open a conversation about race, gender, and ideology when students seem to be a little bit conservative? So thank you, Liz, for that question. And I'll try to answer it at this point, and maybe later on in the webinar, there might be some other ideas. But I think that the first step I usually want to take with my students is to have them reflect on their own identities first. I think it's a little bit safer when they get an opportunity to think about their own identities and all of their complexities, and from there thinking about privilege as related to their identities. And so having students reflect on themselves first might be less threatening than having them jump right into a conversation about race, gender, and ideology, because we all have, regardless of our identities, we all have privileges, either in different contexts or in different parts of identities, right? Like, and so even though, for example, in my case, as an East Asian woman in an academic setting, like I have a lot of privilege there compared to other individuals, right, in that same academic setting, right? So I think having students start with their own self-reflection first can be really helpful in engaging those topics. But okay, so I'm gonna continue here. And I'm gonna talk a little bit about the consequences of ideologies very briefly and present you with some research that might be helpful. But, and so some of the consequences for students is that there has been research that suggests that students learn to position target language speakers as others in the US. And so in other words, that they might have internalized, right, these one-to-one mappings. And so seeing other speakers in the United States, they actually say, oh yeah, they are, others, right? Surprisingly, right, that we would think that students in our language classes would gain more intercultural awareness, but I don't think that that's always automatic. The second is that students oftentimes will expect monolingual immersion. So, myself included, as having been a language learner, is that we've been socialized so much to say, okay, monolingual immersion is the best or only way, right, to learn another language. And so students who go abroad, for example, expect this monolingual immersion. And then when they face the reality of host communities abroad, when in fact it's not just that they're using Spanish or just Chinese, all of a sudden it's very shocking for them. Another is ethno-racial insecurity. And so that one-to-one mapping of expecting that if you have a particular phenotype, you should speak the language associated with that phenotype. And if you don't, right, for a number of reasons, both structural and cultural, it can lead to a lot of ethno-racial insecurity, that you feel like you're less, Chinese or less Latin, Latino, because you don't speak the language associated with that phenotype. A lot of linguistic insecurity, right? So especially, for heritage speakers, if you think about the fact that you're not displaying strictly monolingual language abilities, then you might feel a bit insecure that, oh, maybe I don't really know that language. I'm not really a native speaker. And then these ideologies also lead to a lot of raciolinguistic profiling. In other words, this expectation that if you look a certain way, then you should have proficiency in this language, but maybe not have proficiency in another language, for example. And then lack of educational support. So again, going back to that idea of the prototypical L2 learner, if our curriculums are designed with that audience in mind, it could be that we don't have academic support, right, to have, for students that don't fit that stereotypical mold. And we see examples, right, in academic research, but we also see a lot of examples in, like on NPR, where this student talks about how they judge themselves for speaking Spanglish, and how they don't consider that perhaps it is a valid language practice, right, or a language in itself. There's also a lot of consequences for teachers. And so the research shows that there's a lot of insecurities about ethno-linguistic identities, again, related to the earlier slide, right? That if maybe you don't speak the language associated with your phenotype or your cultural identity, then you're somehow less, or you're not part of that community. And you can see that up here in the image that I have from this study by Fayez Escobar and colleagues, right? Where these were Latinx bilingual teacher candidates, and they were reflecting on how individuals have expectations for what they should or shouldn't, what languages they should or shouldn't speak based on their perceived phenotype. And so again, insecurities about their language abilities, and then also their professional capacity. And so some of the research that we're looking at teachers felt like, you know, in the case of Spanish English bilingual teachers, they felt like, well, if I don't speak this standardized monolingual variety, perhaps I shouldn't be a teacher of Spanish or a bilingual teacher. And then also there's cooperating teachers who expect normative language use and may have deficit outlooks towards bilingual teacher candidates, right? So some cooperating teachers who have been socialized into expecting the standardized language variety, and when they encounter teachers that don't have that, it could be quite shocking. Okay, so given these consequences, right, and given these ideologies, what are some critical pedagogical approaches that we can take to potentially disrupt, right, and interrupt these ideologies? Okay, and so I'm really drawing on 3 frameworks, right? The first is translanguaging, and so I would highly recommend, if you haven't already, to watch the webinar from Dr. Emma Trentman, which was the earlier webinar of this season series, because she really talks about, right, translanguaging pedagogies and how it counters with monolingual language ideologies. The second framework that I draw from is this idea of critical language awareness. And then the third is social justice education. And I really think that all of these 3 in combination can really inform, you know, as a way of disrupting or challenging these ideologies. And so very briefly, right, why translanguaging, or why do I advocate for this translanguaging framework? And it's because translanguaging, right, accepts and leverages the fluid communicative practices of multilinguals. And so translanguaging isn't adhering to monolingual or monoglossic language expectations, right? It's really honoring the fact that we all have a huge array of resources at our disposal to make meaning and to communicate, and that we should use those as part of the language learning process. Also, language system as a unitary system. So thinking again as a linguistic repertoire, rather than thinking about, oh, we have, you know, multiple autonomous systems. We have a system that's just our English knowledge. We have another system that's autonomous, that's just our Spanish knowledge, that's just our French knowledge, etc. That is not the case, right, from a translanguaging perspective. And the goal of translanguaging, right, is, and it's very much tied to social justice education, is that it gives voice to students in an attempt to remedy these hierarchies or power differentials associated with the ideologies that we've discussed thus far. And you can see on the right-hand image, this is an example of what translanguaging would look like in a classroom in terms of the use of multiple languages, the students' languages, home languages, in the classroom setting. The second framework that I'm drawing from is this idea of critical language awareness, right? And this, again, very much aligns with the perspectives and goals of translanguaging, but critical language awareness entails teaching students how language functions in the maintenance of societal power relations. And like translanguaging, it aims to transform students' consciousness of their communicative behaviors and the conditions under which they live, right? And so on the image on the left-hand side here, this was an example from a study that I did with pre-service Spanish teachers, but where it was an activity where students were taking an ideology that we had talked about and then really dissecting, like, what are the consequences of this ideology perhaps for society, right? And so this student had chosen, like, if you don't speak standard Spanish, you are labeled uneducated. And so what are the possible consequences of that? And so, you know, she thought about that schools put an emphasis on teaching standard Spanish. So non-standard Spanish speakers might feel embarrassed, inferior, right? This might cause them to have less motivation in the classroom, lower grades, higher dropout rates, etc. And so again, critical language awareness is really getting students not only to recognize what the ideologies are, but also how does that maintain certain social structures, right, or hierarchies in society. And then lastly, drawing from social justice education, right? And social justice education is about challenging, disrupting, and confronting misconceptions and stereotypes, right? And I think that that's very much aligned with the ideologies that we've talked about, because ideologies and stereotypes are very much interrelated, right? And it aims to, again, sort of building on translanguaging, social justice education draws on students' talents and strengths, right? So if we are recognizing the language abilities that our students already bring into the classroom, right, that's directly aligned with what social justice education is also advocating for. And then like across all three of these frameworks, the goal is really to promote critical thinking and agency for social change. So we want students to be able to recognize, right, to have these tools at their disposal to be able to recognize how, not only how, that these ideologies exist, right, but how are these ideologies being used, and what can they do, right, to disrupt these hierarchies. And so I wanna pause here, and I think there are some questions in the Q&A, and I think if it's okay, maybe I can answer a few of them now, Beatrice.
Yeah, that would be fine if you
Okay.
want me to read them, or if you want, yeah, that's fine. So I think Kimberly had a question, which I think you started more or less answering, but she thanks you for this talk, insightful talk, and she's wondering how you would suggest changing the native speaker ideology that is so prevalent in language classes and even teacher preparation programs in this country and beyond. And it is such a limiting goal that does not represent the majority of language learners and teachers. So how would you suggest going about that?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Kim. I think so. I think one, we have to probably recognize that our spheres of influence are only so limited, right? We all work within the confines of standards that are set outside of us, right? We work within curriculum or departments that also have goals that are set outside of what we're able to control. But I think that for me, I think about the learning objectives and the assessments that I use in my classroom. And so when I think about, for example, at a beginner level class, right, the assessments that we might have set, and rather thinking about, we're going to use the native speaker as the target norm, as the correct answer or ideal, right, for the goal, the end goal. Maybe reframing it as thinking about more so like, okay, for our assessments, we can grade something as, okay, this conjugation is incorrect, or we can maybe grade it, we could reshape the assessment so that the assessment is more like, why are you choosing to use this particular verb conjugation or this particular choice, instead of thinking of it as the prescriptive native, quote unquote, native speaker ideal as the final right answer, if that makes sense, right? And so not setting the native speaker as the only or as the ideal target of all of our assessments and our learning objectives, right? And then also what I have tried to do in the last couple of years is thinking also about the input that I bring into my classroom. So I don't, before, the way that I was trained and socialized was like all of my input had to be just in Spanish, right? Because that was what I was trained to do. And then more recently, I've been reflecting on like, it's okay to bring multilingual input into my classroom. And then students also see that it's not this monolingual only input in my classroom, right? So, those are some of the strategies that I think about.
Yeah. Thank you. There was another question that went in the Q&A, but actually also was in the chat, and to which you already provided an answer. It was about, how do you open up a conversation about race, gender, and ideology with students that might hold more conservative views. And I think unless you have anything else to add with respect to that, it was already handled.
Yeah, I think later on in my next slides that I might get that question, it gets addressed a little bit more as well.
Okay, great. Um, yeah, and Mohammed talked about, how about creating a social justice oriented class culture. And I think that's what you were kind of talking about in your last slide before we stop.
And I also say that being very clear in my like syllabus is something that I also do with my students so that they know the orientation that I'm taking to how I have designed or how I'm approaching a particular class. So for me, like having it in the syllabus sets the tone that this is, and from the very first day, right, this is the perspective that I'm taking.
Yeah, so we have three more questions, but I think I'm going to jump to the last one, and then maybe can come back later to the other two, since we were just talking about translanguaging and you kind of moving from kind of a monolingual norm in your classroom and then more and more integrating other languages in it. So Liz asked, could you provide example of class activities that incorporate what you said about translanguaging and social justice education?
Yeah, and I think maybe that I can like you say, I'll segue this then into the next couple slides, because that's kind of what I'm hoping the last part of my webinar will talk about, right? Is like what can we do in the classroom? And I'll give you some ideas of what I do and how I'm trying to reframe my approach to thinking about my language teaching and my language planning, and then and hopefully that will address this question.
So maybe just one last question, and then the other
Yep.
questions are more classroom related,
Mhm.
which is what you're going to be talking about next. Valentin is asking, how would you recommend to approach a talk on language hierarchies, especially for TESOL teachers? Many act as neoliberal agents, bringing a valuable country to the others with little to no thought of the consequences of this.
Yeah. I think, again, starting with each person's own self-reflection, I find can be helpful before just jumping right into I think it depends on how the conversation is happening, right? If this is just a larger professional development where there's a large audience and you don't know them, then maybe perhaps you can't necessarily do that. And so I think giving very concrete examples of how linguistic hierarchies are being reproduced in the field of TESOL is really helpful. But if it's a more intimate group setting, I think that having the participants start with their self-reflections first, right, can make it so that it's not necessarily, so that it's they have an opportunity to think about, right, how we are all part of these hierarchies and these social structures. And then in that way, enter into a conversation more broadly about hierarchies could be very helpful, right? So,
Great. Thank you. So we can move on with the presentation, and then we'll come
okay,
back to some of the questions later on.
sure, sounds great.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, so I want to just, the last part of this webinar is really thinking about what we can do in the classroom. And so I'll sort of present some activities or some things that I do in my class, and also how I try to, like I said earlier, reframe how I think about my language teaching and how I go about presenting information and in my classroom. So the first one is perhaps to think about teaching language descriptively and sociolinguistically. So I had brought up earlier about the standardized language variety. What that does is it promotes a lot of prescriptive normative language instruction in our classrooms. And it also oftentimes limits sociolinguistic variation in the classroom. And so I would advocate that we kind of shift our thinking and think of, instead of teaching our students, for example, what you should or you shouldn't say, maybe encourage our students to think more about noticing how people use language in different contexts. And I think it really aligns with translanguaging and critical language awareness in particular. And so one example that I have is that oftentimes in beginner level language courses, we do like greetings, right, and presentations. And oftentimes it's like, if you follow a more textbook oriented model, it's these lists of how you can memorize how to greet people, right? And so in an effort to not have students just memorize remotely what that is, I try to present students with individuals who are doing, who are actually presenting themselves or introducing their friends to each other, and having students, listen and read this transcript, and then from there kind of making their own conclusions, right? And sorting like, okay, what can we use for saludos or greetings? What can we use for introductions? What can we use for saying goodbye to people? And so and I think that this can be applied to grammar teaching as well, right? Again, oops, sorry, let me go back here. Oftentimes what we do is, we might, at least in the textbook sense, right? I'm not saying that we all do this, but in the textbook, the presentation is oftentimes like, here's these verb conjugations, and here are these rules and like explanations, right? But I think that we can maybe gear towards more of an inductive grammar instruction where the goal is for students, again, not to memorize all these prescriptive rules, but rather to start to like recognize and describe language patterns, right? And then also present them with different input, so that there's a recognition that there isn't just one right way of saying something or using a particular verb tense, that there's actually quite a lot of variation in how speakers use different language features, right? And then again, being very mindful of how we talk about language. So just simply by trying to not use language like you can't say this, or you can say this, you should say this is correct, this is incorrect, right? Just shifting how we talk about language, I think can have a huge impact in getting students not to go into that mindset of dichotomizing, like this is right, this is wrong, right? And then we can also sort of, again, give students the skills to recognize how is spoken language different from written language, right? Getting students to be aware of that. I think even from the very beginning, especially for those of us who are teaching like high school or university level students, I mean, these students are adults, right? They have the cognitive capacity, I think, to think about language in complex ways. The second is to think about sociolinguistic variation along with its social implications. And so this is in an effort to challenge, again, the monolingual language ideology and the standard language ideology. So I think on the one hand, it's important for us to incorporate sociolinguistic variation into our teaching from the very beginning, right? And I'm glad somebody had brought up this idea of gender neutral pronouns, because that was actually one of the examples that I wanted to bring up, was that even at the beginner levels, if you're teaching a language that marks gender, I think that we can use that as an opportunity, even from like the very beginning, to say like, then there's also all these other ways that speakers are choosing to mark or not mark gender, right? And that would be one opportunity. I think lexical variety is a very easy thing to bring up even at the very beginner levels. Forms of address, right? Again, like that idea with vos, right? That I brought up with Spanish. So these are not very, very difficult concepts. I think even in our first year courses, right? Students can grasp that, especially because in their home languages, I'm pretty sure their home languages are doing the same thing, right? And so you can make that connection. And then as students get more advanced, then I think there are more opportunities to bring in like morphosyntactic or grammatical variation, phonetic variation. And again, I think bringing in a range of input into the classroom from different geographical regions, socioeconomic class, context, right, of different backgrounds can add to students realizing that this conception of like a single native speaker monolingual standardized norm is not just it doesn't exist, right? It's an imaginary that that has been created. But aside from just sociolinguistic variation, I think it's also important to include the social implications of those choices in our classroom. And so if we're at the first year level and we're talking about gender marking, I think, again, there's a very good opportunity to enter into that conversation of, why is in Spanish using the X or the X to mark gender? Why is that so controversial? I think students can engage in that conversation already, even at the beginner levels, right? Maybe you might need to revert a little bit to, using their home languages or trans language a little bit, right? To be able to enter into a very complex discussion about that, but it might be a very fruitful one, right? And so what I like to do in my classes to get at both sociolinguistic variation and its social implications is to, again, like I said earlier, I use word reference, and I didn't translate this snapshot, but the idea is that I use word reference forums to get students to recognize what are some of the social perceptions of certain variants. So how are certain variants or language practices perceived by others? How and why why are language users judged for using certain variants? Who gets judged and who doesn't? Why do you think this is the case? How would it make you feel if the language features that you use were being judged in this way, right? So all of these questions to kind of help students frame not only what is the sociolinguistic variation, but again, what are the social implications of those choices? Another activity that I like to do is I like to use memes a lot in my teaching. And I think it's because I think for you to understand a meme, you have to actually have quite a bit of knowledge to understand and interpret them. And so in this case, this is again referencing the second person pronoun uses in Spanish, but students really have to understand, like what is going on with vos, or what's going on with vosotros and vosotras, in order to be able to interpret, right, or to understand why this is funny or interesting or attention grabbing, right? And then also having students create their own memes is something that's really fun, because again, you have to have quite a bit of nuanced understanding to be able to create memes that are funny. So the third idea is to think about diversifying your curriculum without essentializing communities. And so again, drawing from translanguaging, drawing from critical language awareness and social justice education, if we are attempting to disrupt this one language, one person, one race, one nation ideology, I think it can be very easy solution for us to think, okay, we have these missing voices or missing communities from our curriculum. We just need to put them into our curriculum. And I think that what can happen is that what we do is we might inadvertently or advertently essentialize or reduce, right, these communities. And going back to that example of inserting Afro-Latinx populations into a textbook, if we just we just put them in there and say, oh yeah, they brought certain musical instruments to the Spanish speaking world, it can be very problematic. And so I think instead we might want to consider how can we show the complexity of traditionally minoritized communities. And so on the one hand, addressing how they've been discriminated and stereotypes, but then on the other hand, also recognizing that they have contributed as agents of change, they have accomplishments, and they are also a very heterogeneous and diverse group of people. And so, for example, when I do talk about Spanish speakers or Latin Americans of African ancestry, I like to bring it up in the context of thinking about how the term itself, right, Afro-Latinx, isn't a term that is, agreed upon across this population, right? And so there are videos of in which, there are discussions about what does that mean, and how that term relates to one's identity, and how it's a very complicated, right, term. For those within this community. And the same, right, I bring in discussions about Asian Latinos because in fact, many of my students have never they never knew that there was Asian immigration whatsoever to the Spanish-speaking world, right? And so bringing in these two videos and having these sort of nuanced conversations about what these identities mean, and why some individuals might be surprised that given their racial, ethnic, cultural background, that they speak Spanish, or that they have African ancestry, but their family is from Latin America, etc. And then in these videos, they also do a lot of translanguaging. And so it gives me an opportunity to, again, bring in these conversations about how Spanish speakers, right, also they speak other languages, they exist in very multilingual contexts, right, etc. The fourth is encouraging students to draw on all available resources for learning and meaning making. And so this particular example, I hope might get at that question about, how do we bring translanguaging and social justice into the classroom? And so this is getting at that idea of how do we encourage translanguaging as a pedagogical perspective in the classroom. And again, I really recommend that you watch Dr. Emma Trentman's webinar on this, because she does a beautiful job of breaking that down. But so here's an activity in which I am trying to develop students like translingual awareness, right, of how multilingual individuals interact, right, and how also they themselves as emerging bilinguals or multilinguals are also developing these capacities. And so here, this is an example of a podcast from an NPR podcast from Radio Ambulante. And so this podcast is typically done in Spanish from all different regional, right, different regions of the Spanish-speaking world, right? But this example in particular is an individual who does a lot of translanguaging with English, right? Because they're talking about their life in Mexico and also in the United States. And so there's a lot of translanguaging that happens. And so I ask, oftentimes I'll have students think about like, okay, when they focus on language, what is it that they don't understand? So is it the content? Is it the language being used? I'll also have them think about, why does the speaker in this example switch to English? Like, what do you think is the purpose of that, right? And for you as somebody who's listening, right, and reading the transcript, what does that, what effect does that have on you as the recipient? And then I also get students to reflect on themselves, like, do you ever switch languages or varieties, and why, and what is the purpose, right? And again, getting them to reflect on how everyone, right, including themselves, use language to communicate and make meaning, oftentimes in very strategic ways. And that's what I want them to walk away with. And then also, which words, expressions, or grammatical structures or pronunciation might seem unique to a particular variety of Spanish or another. And so again, raising their awareness that the strategic choices not only across languages, but then within languages as well. So, for a Spanish speaker, right, you might make choices within the varieties of Spanish depending on who you're speaking with. And so getting students to recognize that the resources are not just across languages, right, but within languages as well. And then the last one, and I think this also gets at my earlier point about reflection. I think that a lot of a key piece of social justice education is reflection, right? And reflection about our own positionality and identity as instructors, right? And so for me, right, constantly reflecting on my teaching, right? Reflecting on what are the pieces that I'm missing, and how I approach my teaching, but then also giving space to students to reflect about themselves and what language means to them, their families, their communities. And so not only just like learning about the target language, but also I really believe that, learning the target language means fitting it into their existing identities already. And so, what are those connections? And so this is an example of an activity, which I call like a linguistic identity map, where I ask students to like really reflect on what forms part of their linguistic identity and their language journey. And so thinking about like key moments, events, people, languages that they've learned, with their family, but also languages that they might have lost, right, in their families, things like that, and the emotions that are associated with this. And it's one, on the one hand, this, I think, activity gets it sort of gets at the prototypical L2 learner ideology and breaking that down, because even for students who we might think have no linguistic heritage, we all have a linguistic heritage, right? And so getting students to think about, even though your family might have become monolingual in the last few generations, what happened? Because maybe there were languages that were part of their family history that have been lost, right? And so then it also allows them to connect with students who are currently maybe in a situation where they feel, like in my case as a Cantonese heritage speaker, right? I can connect with students in that way and thinking, okay, there are individuals and communities now who are feeling this language shift, but this language shift has happened in the past for others. And why? Because ultimately it's the same underlying language ideologies and discourses that have led, right, to these language shifts. So any sort of activity that will just get students to reflect on their language use and their relationship with language and how that connects with larger issues in society. Okay, so I want to pause again and just give you maybe a minute to reflect on these two questions. So one, thinking about, I presented some pedagogical ideas, and so having you think about, which one do you think might benefit your language teaching context? And then also, what challenges do you foresee from taking a ideological framework, right? For thinking about language instruction from this ideological perspective, what challenges do you foresee or imagine? And so I'll just give us a minute for you to reflect on that, and you're welcome to include your thoughts in the chat or to simply just jot it down for yourself. So I see a comment from Janice, I hope I'm saying your name correctly, about the language mapping identity map, and I can go back to that. But yeah, and again, with this activity, I was really hoping that students, don't only think about like languages as like English, French, Spanish, Arabic, Chinese, right? But more so also for students who might think of themselves as strictly monolingual, that they can also incorporate like varieties, right? That you spoke a particular home variety, and then you went to school and you probably started learning an academic variety at school, right? So just getting students to really think about the complexities of varieties and languages. Okay, so I will address this idea of challenges because I also think it was, I think somebody else had also brought up this question, but I think one of the challenges oftentimes that we'll foresee is this idea, the larger structural challenges, right? That again, as instructors, many of us work within the confines of our departments, in our colleges, right? And so, or our community settings. And so thinking about like, what can we do within our own classroom, within our syllabus and our lesson design? I think that, channeling our energies to be able to change how we present language to our students is one way, right, of like being able to use this ideological framework. I think another challenge is, yeah, changing our students' perspectives of themselves, right? Because our students have, for those of us who are teaching at the high school or university level, if students have been taking language before us, they will have had, years of socialization into being thought of as, monolingual immersion, for language learning, or that they need to have grammar like charts, and that's how they learn, right? I've had students tell me like, this is, I don't want to describe language, like I need to be told exactly what the rules are. So I think that's an ongoing challenge, right? Is to reframe how students themselves think about what the language classroom, what the role of the language classroom is, and what the point of language classes are. And this is especially challenging for like first year language courses where many of our students are taking it just for a requirement. And so they're trying to check a box. And so getting students to see the utility of language learning as not only just language learning and the assessments that are given to them, but more as that this has far-reaching consequences and to other parts of their life, I think is an important way of trying to reframe how our students think about the language classroom. I think also colleagues can be very challenging. So some of us might work in an environment where others have more traditional perspectives about language, or perhaps just they might not think about language in this way. And so again, I think that the ongoing challenge is that what you do in your classroom might not be reflected in other classes or in the larger curriculum, right? And so I don't have a perfect solution for that, except to say that that doesn't mean we shouldn't do this kind of work, right? But that is definitely a challenge, right? Is that if your classroom might be very critically oriented, but then the other ones are not, then you get this conflict, right? Okay, and so I just want to end so that we can have time for the Q&A, but I just want to end with a quote from one of my case studies. This is from Ari. You saw her ideology tree activity earlier, but this is Ari, and she's a bilingual Mexican-American pre-service Spanish teacher. And I just want to read her quote, to end today, but she said, I definitely had that thought of, oh, I don't speak proper Spanish. I felt like I was behind because there was people that had already taken some Spanish classes and basically knew a bit about writing, grammar. I could speak it, but I just felt like my Spanish wasn't there, right? And so I end with this because I want to just, again, sort of show like how these ideologies are so prevalent, right, in everything. It's so prevalent and they just affect so many people, right? And it's sad because Ari, is bilingual. She grew up bilingual. She travels regularly to Mexico with her family. She was working as a bilingual pharmacy technician as she was going through school. And so she's definitely somebody who is able to navigate very complex settings, and yet she still feels like because she doesn't write or know the grammar in the way that L2 students do, she has internalized this idea that she doesn't speak proper Spanish and that her Spanish isn't there yet, right? And again, this is all Ari is definitely channeling, right, and echoing a lot of the language ideologies that we talked about earlier today. But so I just want to say thank you. I have the references here, which I believe are also available on the website. But I just wanted to say, muchas gracias, and thank you for your participation and for listening today. And I think we'll have a little bit of time for questions.
We do. So there's a couple questions relating to professional development. So Zhang Ying, sorry if I mispronounce your name. How do you deal with teachers' resistance in professional development at workshop like this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that trying to show as many examples of how this isn't an isolated or this is not important, and trying to raise the point that language ideologies affect all of us, right? So even if I think I speak the standard variety and I don't get discriminated against, I just think that that's not true. I think that language ideologies ultimately make all of us, they all sort of at some point make us feel inadequate, or the gatekeeping that happens from language ideologies ultimately affects every single person, right? And so trying to get them to realize this isn't an isolated issue, I think is my first step.
Another question is kind of related to the last slide in your presentation with that teacher's quote. G says, thank you for the great presentation. Do you have any recommendations on how we can help teachers feel more secure about their teaching abilities and professional capacity?
Yes, I think illuminating or discussing ideologies explicitly helps oftentimes, because I have had pre-service teachers and in-service teachers, and myself included, like where when you see that others are feeling the same way that you do, that this is actually a documented phenomenon that's rooted in structural racism or language and raciolinguistic ideologies, then I think one can start to feel like it's not an individual feeling, that it's not just them, or that they are lesser than, but that this is a much larger issue, right? And so that's what's going on. It's not just them feeling this way, right? And I also think it's really important that we also train our cooperating teachers and the faculty that work with these teachers, like pre-service and in-service teachers, because a lot of times these ideologies are perpetuated in other spaces that teachers are interacting in. And so I think it needs to be reinforced across the board that that they, cooperating teachers are also aware that these ideologies exist, and they don't want to reproduce them for the teachers that they're mentoring.
There's an interesting question that brings the context of Spanish as our heritage language. So Isabella says, Dr. Quan, thank you so much for an important webinar. Speaking of this difference between home and academic language, a lot of times we see an approach focus on the contrast between formal and informal Spanish in the heritage language classroom, which ends up reinforcing these ideologies you just talked about. I would like to hear your insights on how to address this issue in the SHL classroom.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question. I agree. I think that distinction between appropriateness and inappropriateness is very problematic in reinforcing ultimately these hierarchies, right, and these ideologies. And so I think that one, it's important that students recognize that regardless of how problematic those distinctions are, they exist, right, in society. And I think that students need to know that. Students need to walk away realizing that there are certain language features that will be judged as formal and some will be judged as informal. And so teaching them what those distinctions are and why, right? And then giving students the tools to make those choices, right? So if a student is writing an academic paper, and they know that certain variants are associated with certain distinctions or social characteristics, they can make that choice, and those choices have consequences for them, given the space, right? Because unfortunately, I as an instructor can't break down that space for them everywhere they go. And so that's one way that I have thought about that problem. I'm not saying that that's the perfect solution, but I definitely agree with you. I think that distinction of formal, informal, appropriate, inappropriate is a very problematic one that does reinforce these ideologies, especially if we don't teach students that is problematic, right? And we just say, oh, we're in this class, I'm just teaching you academic Spanish.
Maybe we'll take one last question. There were a couple others, but I think they've been more or less addressed in the presentation or in previous answers. But Sky is saying the intersection of Indigenous identity can be challenging for students and teachers. There are many Indigenous students who have had their language stolen from them and only have access to learning languages new to their territory. Some students may not be aware of how this intergenerational trauma can impact their learning. It was more a comment than a question, but maybe you want to address some aspect of it.
Yeah, I think I agree, right? I think that that I'm obviously coming at this from a perspective of teaching a colonial language, right? And so the context is very, very different. And I think that thinking about critical language awareness and thinking about social justice education, I think that that's why it's important that the language classroom not just be a language classroom where I'm teaching my students how to, I don't know, order a coffee in Spanish. Because like, again, I think that the way that we think about language has repercussions like the one that you brought up. And so making students aware of of how language has been used to, as a form of like cultural genocide, or as a way of constant discrimination across contexts. Like those are very important topics that I think, surpass just learning about the basics of the language, if that makes sense, right? So that, yes, I appreciate, and I thank you for that comment.
Great. So thank you so much. We've reached the end of this webinar. I want to thank our presenter for giving such a thought-provoking presentation. And I want to also let Tracy know that there are many, many thanks in the chat, and many people have found this presentation, your talk, really inspiring and bringing lots of different ideas that they need to take into consideration. So I also thank our participants for their comments and interesting questions. And I want to remind you, because some of that came up in some comments, that we will have another webinar on May 11th at 4 p.m. local time that will focus on gender just pedagogies, and that some of you had questions about this. So please remember, put this in your calendar, and just thank you again, and have a wonderful end of the week. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everybody, and thank you, Circle, again, for the invitation.
Thank you.